I feel like a lot of beginner photographers oftentimes compare their photographs with ones taken by professional photographers and wonder what the difference is, or what's the secret sauce that's making these professional photographers stand out so much. And while some of that might come down to some technical foundations or a little bit of artistry or an eye for composition, a lot of times it comes down to the post-processing, or how one manipulates the raw files. So in this video, I'm going to be revealing a few secrets or a few dirty tricks that us pro photographers use when we edit our photographs. Starting with this one. So here is a beautiful young male muskox. He is gallivanting across the tundra. This was taken last year while I was leading a group of photographers on a workshop up in Arctic Alaska. And while we had really good wildlife conditions, the lighting and the landscape here is not so good. It's a little bit boring, to be honest. It's pretty overcast. The tundra is definitely past its peak, and the lighting just isn't very good. So I'm gonna show you guys how to fix this. So the first thing we need to do is straighten this out or level it out, because right now it is definitely a little askew and wonky. So I'm just gonna hit R, that's the hotkey that's gonna open up the crop tool. And then I can take this little level here. You can click on that, and then click on one side and just drag to another side just along the horizon, and that's gonna straighten it out. Another thing that I can see in this is there's a lot of dead space or empty space at the bottom of the frame and also the top of the frame. Not a whole lot is going on, so we don't need that. We can just go ahead and crop down from the top and the bottom. I'm gonna change it to maybe a 16:9 aspect ratio, and then I think we can pull it down a little bit more. And then I'm gonna just place this corner here of the guideline right over the eye of Mr. Muskox here. I'm gonna hit enter, that's gonna confirm that. And then we can go ahead and start working on some of the tonal changes. So I'm gonna do some basic stuff by taking down the highlights a little bit, maybe bring up the shadows, bring up the exposure a little bit. I'm gonna bring up the blacks. Maybe that's a little bit too much on the exposure. Maybe that looks okay. And then maybe I could go up on the whites just a little bit as well. So already we're looking a little bit better, but right now there's a few things that are popping out that are distracting me from the muskox, because we want the muskox to be the star of the show. And right now, kind of this empty space at the bottom here, it's a little bit too bright. I don't want to crop it out because we need it in there to ground the image, but it's so bright that it's taking my attention away from the star of the show. So I'm gonna go ahead and fix that by going up to our masking panel here, clicking on this, and then going over to linear gradient. And then I'm going to click just outside of the frame and then pull up. If I wanna keep this level, I just hold the shift key down and that locks it in place. And I could do something like that. And then I can take the exposure down just a little bit to kind of ground the image, to make sure that my eye does not stray too far from the muskox and it doesn't go down to looking at the ugly tundra that's way past its peak. It stays on the muskox. So we can just see quick before, after, looks okay. I'm gonna go ahead now and do the same thing to the sky, because again, the sky is quite bright and it is distracting. So I'm just gonna create a new mask with a linear gradient, click, and I'm gonna hold down shift just at the top of the frame here. And then I'm gonna take the exposure down just a little bit, just so it's not overwhelmingly bright like it was up here, to make sure the muskox is the main focus of the photograph. To continue to do this, I'm going to create a new mask here. And in this one, I'm going to create a radial gradient. I'm gonna make a big fat one right over the muskox. I'm gonna kind of tilt it to the side, maybe make it a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to actually invert the selection. So everything around the muskox is selected and then is feathered over to the muskox. And from here, I'm going to take the exposure down a little bit, and that is going to, again, draw the viewer's eye right onto the muskox here. So he's still not quite popping out of the screen like I want him to. So I'm gonna create a new mask and go to select subject. It's gonna do a very good job at selecting Mr. Muskox here. And then I can go ahead and bring up these whites, which is going to make him stand out a little bit more. I like the look of what bringing up the whites does, but it also makes it maybe a little bit unnatural. So that I'm just gonna take the exposure down a couple clicks to kind of even it out. Then we can just see the before and the after, before, after. So far, this stuff has all been pretty basic in terms of masking, but there's still one big step left. So looking at this photo, there is one glaring problem with it, at least in my eyes, is that it is all the same color, or it is all earth tones. It's a bunch of different shades of brown. So we got brown tundra down here, we got a brown muskox, we got a brown background, and we even got kind of a brown looking sky. So one of the ways we can fix this is with my first dirty cheater tip. To add a little bit color back in here, all I'm gonna do is create a new mask, go over to select sky, and from here, we can go down and actually add what Adobe calls a color effect. You can click on this and then select a color here. I'm just gonna select this first blue one. Otherwise, you can select a color from this palette here. So let's go ahead and click on that. Bippity boppity blue sky. Look how happy this muskox is. Let's go ahead and compare this before, after, before, after. And if we decide this is a little too strong, we just go down here to this amount slider, and then we could take it from 0 all the way up to 100 if we want to. Maybe somewhere right around 30, 35, 40, somewhere in that range. Let's go ahead and again check this. Off, on, off, on. So this is something I use all the time. It works on so many different photos, you would not believe it. And it's kind of ridiculous. I haven't seen anyone else use it. I'm positive I'm not the first person. I definitely didn't come up with this. It's definitely something that's a dirty little cheater move, but it works really well. So this next photo here, we have a beautiful bristlecone pine tree. We're gonna go ahead and jump into our develop module and make a few quick tonal adjustments just like we did with the last photo. This time I'm gonna change my picture profile to Adobe Landscape. It's gonna give me a little bit more saturation and a little bit less contrast. I'm gonna go down on the highlights a little bit, maybe go down a little bit less on the contrast, a little bit up on the exposure, tiny bit up on the shadows, maybe a little bit up on the blacks, bring those up a little bit. So something I like to do with any of my twilight or blue hour photos is to just crank up the whites. I just wanna crank them up almost all the way. It's gonna bring out that kind of ethereal glow from the twilight or from the blue hour. So you just go ahead and crank up those whites a little bit, maybe around 40, somewhere in there. And then if it's too much, we can go ahead and bring back down the exposure to get it to a more natural look. So the next thing I'm wanting to do is change the kind of the color balance or some of the saturation a little bit. And rather than use the color balance or white balance up here, I'm actually gonna do this through the calibration sliders. So I click on this and then go over here, and I want to increase some of the reds that is naturally in this soil. And I'm gonna do so by increasing the red primary saturation slider. And I'm gonna go pretty high on that to get the reds where I want them to. And you can see it's not only bringing out the reds in the landscape, it's also doing so in the trunks of these bristlecone pine trees as well. So unfortunately now I think it's a little bit too blue, so we can go ahead and counteract this by taking down the saturation of the blue slider. So let's just take that down a little bit to even this saturation out a little bit more. So let's go ahead and look at that before and after on the calibration. So I'm pretty happy with this image so far, but there's one glaring problem. So ignoring the sky, when we look at this photo, we can see the brightest thing is not our main subject. The brightest thing is actually the foreground down here, and that is a big problem. Our eyes are naturally attracted to bright and shiny things, so to make this tree stand out, we have to brighten this up while also darkening the foreground. So to fix this is a trick I use in literally every single photo. I'm gonna go ahead up to our masking panel here, and I'm gonna click on a radial gradient, and I'm gonna make a big radial gradient right over our big bristlecone pine right here. I'm gonna make it a little bit off center, just like that. Maybe make it out a little bit more. Take the feathering down a little bit. And then I'm going to increase this exposure. Not a whole lot, but just a little bit. And I'm also gonna increase the blacks. Increasing the blacks is gonna also help add depth to the photo it's gonna make it seem a little bit further away than the foreground. So now that I made the tree brighter, I can go ahead and do the opposite by making everything else darker. If we click on these three dots here and go down to duplicate and invert mask, that's gonna give me another mask that is completely inverted from the one we just created. So from here, I can take the exposure down. I'm gonna do so quite a bit, almost a full stop, or maybe 3/4 of a stop. I'm gonna hit enter to confirm that, and we can toggle both of these masks off and on. And you can see how just a couple of radial gradients was able to bring our focus in on the tree and make it stand out as our subject. So I'm pretty happy with the direction this photograph is going, but for me, it looks a little bit flat, and I wanna add some depth or some three-dimensionality back into the photograph. And right now I'm gonna do so through some dodging and burning. Let's come up here and create a new mask with a brush. I'm gonna make sure my flow is down low, maybe somewhere around 20. I wanna make sure my feathering is all the way up. And let's just bring up the whites and up the exposure a little bit. And I'm just gonna brush a little bit of light onto the scene. And I'm just gonna kind of add a little bit of depth and a little bit of dimensionality to this. I'm gonna go add a little bit of brightness over here on this section of the ground. You can see I'm going overboard on some of this stuff. That's okay, we can just back it off later. Maybe add a little bit of lightness back down here into the foreground. Just a little bit of extra oomph to this scene. We can see though that if I toggle on the show overlay, the effect is going into the sky, and we obviously don't want that. So this is a super simple fix. All we need to do is go to subtract, select sky, and there we go. The dodging is only affecting the landscape. Let's toggle off the show overlay with the O key, and then we can see the before and after, before and after. Now we're gonna do the opposite and add just a little bit of burning or a little bit of darkening in some areas of the photo. We're gonna do this again with a brush, and instead of brightening it, we're just gonna darken it with the exposure. And then we can kind of shade on this left-hand side of the image and on the left-hand side of the tree a little bit. Maybe down here, make some of these shadows a little bit darker. So when dodging and burning, you don't want to darken or lighten things that aren't naturally light or dark. I'm not going to lighten something that is in a shadow or try to take somewhere in the shadows and add light to it. It just doesn't work out that way. Another thing you have to pay attention to is the direction that the light is coming from. You can see in this photograph that the light source, even though it is very soft, is coming from the right-hand side. And so we have to think about that when dodging and burning. So I'm going to darken the left side of these things and lighten the right-hand side, because that's how the light is behaving in real life. And if we toggle on the show overlay, we can see that again, the mask is going into the sky. We don't want that. So all we do is subtract sky and we're good to go. So right now I'm pretty happy. I think the shot looks really cool. It's all coming together. But there's still one thing that's not quite working for me. So right now, I don't love just how blue the sky is. It's a little bit bothersome to me, and I want to add a little bit more color variation into the sky. So I'm gonna do so by creating a new mask up here. I'm gonna go down to radial gradient, and I'm gonna make a big fat mask right over here on the right-hand side. Kind of angle it and bring it over like this. So there's a very even fall off in the gradation. Obviously we can't make any adjustments to this right now because it would affect the landscape. So if we go over to these three dots here and then go down to intersect mask with, we can intersect this with the sky, and only where the two masks meet up will it show through. So let's select sky, and there we go. We have our radial gradient, and I can move this all around as much as I want to, and it's only affecting where the sky intersects with the radial gradient. So let's leave it right there, and I'm gonna go down and I'm gonna add another color effect, or kind of a color overlay. This time though, instead of going cool, I'm gonna go warm by selecting one of these yellow color palettes, something like this. And if that's not strong enough, I could go a little bit stronger, or maybe I could even choose something a little bit warmer here. Go a little bit stronger on this. Maybe you could even bring up a little bit of the blacks in the scene. And then we can see if I toggle this off and then on, off and then on. Doing this, you get a nice gradation in the sky, just so everything isn't solidly one color. So here's one more shot. You can see in this one, I'm almost all the way there in editing. I really like the mud cracks in the foreground, and I like over here this white wash that leads up into this butte or this kind of spire in the background. But I feel like the mud cracks are kind of separate and they don't really connect with the rest of the landscape. So one of the ways we can fix this is by creating our own leading line. If we go over to our masking panel again, I'm gonna select a brush. Going to bring up the whites and up the exposure. And then we are just going to brush on a little bit of a leading line in this scene. We're going to lighten up these front or foreground mud tiles, and we're going to connect them with this kind of natural curve here. We're going to brighten that up and connect it to these. And that is going to lead our eye right into this kind of white wash area, which is then going to lead us naturally into this butte or this spire back here. And then we can see if I toggle this off and then on again, off and then on again, maybe this is a little bit too strong. I can go down a little bit on the amount slider, off, on, that's a little bit better. Super simple editing trick. All I did was brush a bright line into the scene, but it kind of blends in naturally. You don't really notice it after you look at the photo, and it works to connect the foreground with the midground to the background. So let me know, guys, were these tricks dirty enough? Do you have your own dirty editing tricks? I'd love to know down in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.